Constant Viljoen, who was the chief of the army at the time, initially said maximum 100 kilometers north of the border, not more than that. But when the first fire force deployed and he went up to have a look at what was going on, he immediately said, make it 200, So the guys were deploying up to 200 kilometers inside Rhodesia. And in fact, quite often they went more than that. If the insurgents that they were looking for were going further north, then that's what they did. And the Rhodesians, just managed the whole setup. The task was given to the paratroopers. Now at that stage, the paratroopers had 3 battalions. One Para Bde was national servicemen, regular force officers and senior officers and NCOs, but the soldiers were national servicemen doing a 2-year stint of national service. And then 2 and 3 parachute battalions that were citizen force. And these were guys who'd completed their 2 years of national service, and they were called up for sometimes 30 days, sometimes 60 days, sometimes 90 days. But every year they were called up for one of those periods, and they would often be deployed up in Namibia or Angola. But now there was this requirement for a company to be sent into the southeast of Rhodesia. And they did. And initially it was termed, let me just check. Fire Force Bravo. They were initially called Fire Force Bravo. It was just one company of paratroopers, national servicemen. It was a well-experienced company. They'd done a lot of operations in Namibia and Angola. And when they got to Rhodesia, what happened was they went up to Madimbu, which was an airfield which was specially built, tar airfield, tar surface, not 10 kilometers from the border, the Limpopo River. And we had a strip of land that was a sort of no man's land, about 10 kilometers wide, I think it was, and maybe 50 kilometers in length, right up from just slightly to the east of Beit Bridge, all the way to the Kruger Park. And that strip of land, only the military was allowed in there. And it was dense bush, baobab trees, marula trees, rocky koppies, and we did most of our coin training. We'd come up from Bloemfontein and do our coin training over there. And so often while we were doing our training, we'd hear a firefight going on across the other side of the river, because the Rhodesians were very active over there. So it was a good place to do that, and you could send patrols into the Kruger Park, and the guys could get accustomed to having all sorts of animals and things around them. So it was a good area for training. And Madimbu airfield was built there. There was nothing else there, just an airfield and a tented encampment. And the first company was sent up, and they had to now masquerade as Rhodesians. So we had a logistics capability there at the base, in that tented base. And from Bulawayo, they got a whole lot of Rhodesian camo uniforms. And what would happen was the guys would land at Madimbu. They'd get off the aircraft and have to fall in on one side of the airfield. The other side was where the base was. And they'd then strip. All they'd be left with was their underpants and their boots. Everything else was put into a tog bag, which was, a military balsak, as we called it, a brown tog bag, and labeled and tied up, and that's his South African kit. And with just that, those underpants and boots, he would cross the runway, and on the other side, he'd be issued with a Rhodesian uniform. And he'd get the green T-shirt and the jacket, and I think two shirts and 2 pairs of trousers, and the PT shorts and a few other things like that. And then from there they would deploy into Rhodesia. Either they'd take off, either in a couple of Dakotas, which would ferry them over, or sometimes a C-160 Transall, which could take half a company, and they'd fly them over and land on the airfield inside Rhodesia, and they'd all get off over there. Oh, and the other thing was, before they left Bloemfontein, they'd have to hand their R4 rifles back. And they'd all be issued with an R1 rifle, which is what the Rhodesians called the FN. But the only R1 rifles that we had at one parachute battalion were those with the folding stock, the collapsible butt, because they were para rifles, and they were very nice for when you were parachuting. You could fold the butt out of the way, and it didn't hook on your static line or get in the way or anything else. So then we're now issued with a 7.62 R1 para rifle, and they handed in their 5.56 millimeter R5 rifles, and these were put into the armory.
I've heard from other people who've done this similar sort of talk that you could immediately tell they were South Africans for three things: their boots, their folding butt rifles, and their accents.
Correct. Yeah. There were a number of other little things that crept out as well, but those were the essential things. You could pick that up immediately.
Yeah.
And everybody was told, if you're coming, you're not supposed to come into contact with any civilians over there. But if you should come into contact with, which was nonsense, because the fire forces were moved from one farm to another, and you were always, the farmer and his wife would come down, and they'd give you all sorts of meals and meat and everything else. And I'm only too happy to see you. And so you were told, if you come into contact with any civilians, you tell them you come from Enkeldoorn. Which was a little Afrikaans community. Now, how anybody's going to believe that this whole company of 100 soldiers all come from Enkeldoorn? It's a real tall story. And of course, the South African soldiers could never remember the name, and they knew Doorn, which is thorn, because Enkeldoorn means one thorn, and they knew that the thorn. But there's a military base in South Africa called Doornkop, which means thorny hill. And and the people would say, "Where do you come from?" I said, "No, I come from Doornkop." Guys would know immediately. Any guy who says he comes from Doornkop, he's a South African. So so it was actually a total farce. We weren't fooling anybody. We weren't fooling the local civilians. And at that time, the Brits were already there. They were already being seen in the area. And one of the company commanders who had his company there, he was one of the first companies to go up there. He was called to an order group in Bulawayo, and because later we got a second fire force. Milan and Walls decided that South Africa would provide a second fire force. So the one fell under, I think one was under 4 Brigade and one under 3 Brigade. I'm not quite sure, but anyway, the brigade at Fort Victoria had the one in the east, and then in the west, the brigade at Bulawayo had the other, and they fell under operational command of the brigade. So the brigade gave them the area and gave them the instructions and told them what to do, and they reported to the brigade commander. They also had another line to report back to South Africa, but for operations, they were under the brigade. So they were essentially seen as Rhodesian troops. And this fellow, I would like to find that little article. Well, it wasn't an article. It was just a brief description that he sent me. And it was actually very, very, very amusing to read it, because what happened was he was told he had to report to the brigade headquarters in Bulawayo for a briefing. But he was sent, because they were only issued with camo kit, but now he was sent a sort of a step-out kit, a nice, comfortable shirt and slacks and veldschoen shoes and so on that he was to wear, and that's what he would come to the headquarters in for his briefing. So he got into the Land Rover and he drove up and attended this briefing. Yeah, the operation was known in South Africa as Operation Bowler, Bowler, Operation Boulder. The Rhodesians called it Operation Ballast, Ballast. Um, so the first company arrived and they were deployed, and they first of all they underwent some training, and the training took place at Madimbu. A Rhodesian company commander would come across with one or two of his officers and NCOs. They'd brief them. The air capability would be out the airfield, and then they'd go up and they'd do a couple of practice runs. And because there were some minor differences in the Rhodesian radio procedures and so on that they had to master, and so they went through all of that, um, and then they would go and cross into Rhodesia and deploy at wherever their fire force was placed. And the that first company that went out, when they flew across, when they landed, the siren went off. They hadn't even put their kit down anywhere, and they had to run to get in the aircraft, the Pumas, and off they went. And they carried out it was about a 4-hour contact that they were involved in. It was
Mhm.
quite a large group of insurgents, and they were quite aggressive, and they were being shunted around by the helicopters, and of course the Puma's got a much longer holding time than the Alouette, so it could be out there for that much longer. And the aircraft that they were using were all South African aircraft, with the exception of the Lynx for close air support. That was Rhodesian because we didn't have an aircraft like that. But the Pumas, the Alouettes, they had a little Cessna. Can't remember exactly what they used it for, but they had a Cessna as well. And these guys, they accounted for a phenomenal number of insurgents.
Mm.
And so that was their introduction. And the rest of the time they were there, they were being called out daily, and sometimes several times a day.
Mm.
And that just never happened up in Ondangwa. It would be rare. It did happen that you'd occasionally be called out more than once a day, but it was rare. And the distances were much longer. In Ovamboland,
Mm.
you'd sometimes fly for half an hour or more before you'd get to where the contact area is. Whereas in Rhodesia, they would actually move the fire force to get closer to where the insurgents were.
Mm.
The Rhodesians had a far more mobile approach to the whole concept than what the South Africans did. Um, so our guys learnt a lot from their deployments, and they accomplished quite a bit. Um, and then they changed the names of the fire forces. They became Yankee and Zulu. Um, and and then they started core because we now had the problem that one parachute battalion, and I think it was the only unit that found itself doing this. They were deployed, two fire forces deployed so there were two companies in Rhodesia and one at Ondangwa. And these three fire forces were now deployed simultaneously, and on two fronts, the Rhodesian front and the Angolan front, and fighting three different insurgent armies. Plan from SWAPO, and then ZANU PF's organization, it was still just ZANU at that stage, their organization, and ZIPRA.
Yep.
So you had three different insurgent armies that this one battalion was involved against, uh, on two different fronts, fighting simultaneously. So that was quite an achievement for one Parabon. But one Parabon had so many obligations, operational obligations at that stage, it couldn't maintain that forever. So we started calling up the reserve force, the citizen force, parachute battalions or companies from the parachute battalions, from 2 and 3 parachute battalion. And in the end, over a period of approximately 6 months, 6 or 7 months, there were 6 paratrooper companies deployed in Rhodesia,
Mhm.
and three of them deployed twice.
Mm.
So it was a total of 9 Fire Force deployments, and each deployment lasted for, it would depend. The reserve force guys, the citizen force guys, would normally only go for 4 weeks, but the national servicemen would go for about 6 weeks, uh, sometimes even a little longer. Um, and then they would rotate, and so they were busy with this rotation all the time, and it was a very hectic time for the paratroopers. It was one of the busiest periods of their operational deployment. And sometimes those guys would come back from Rhodesia, where they'd spend a 6 week trip in Rhodesia. They'd go back to Bloemfontein. They'd get a 4 or 5 day pass, and they'd go home, and they'd come back, and they'd get straight into the aircraft and fly up to Ondangwa and be deployed up there for maybe 3 months. So,
Uh,
so it was hectic. But because they were national servicemen, that could be done because they were there. They were belonged to the army for 2 years, so it could be done.
Did you
Uh,
ever get a sense from any of the men that why am I in Rhodesia? It's not my war. Did you ever get that, or were they just really keen?
I never experienced anything like that. As I say, I didn't deploy with any of those fire forces. So I
Right.
was never there myself as part of the fire force.
Okay.
Um, but I spoke to many of the people who were deployed. I never came across that at any stage.
Mm.
We had an unusual situation in the paratroops because all of our guys were volunteers. Although they'd been conscripted and called up for 2 years of national service, they then had to volunteer to become paratroopers. And then you had to go through a stringent selection period to get your wings, to go on the parachute course and get your wings. So they were all guys who were highly motivated. They were there because they wanted to be there, and they were in an elite fighting unit because they wanted to fight. And it wasn't really um, terribly important to them whether they were fighting in Rhodesia or Angola or Zambia or Namibia. And there were some of them who fought in all four of those places. And it wasn't important to them. What was important to them was that they were able to take part in operations. It's always a bit more difficult for um, the older guys who are in the citizen force because the national servicemen were generally unmarried, just out of school, uh, full of bravado, adventurous, not much between their ears yet. So, they're happy to do foolish things. And for many of them, this foolish thing was the greatest thing was to go, let's go become a paratrooper. And then they find that it's hard work and it's not easy and not everybody makes it to become a paratrooper. But if they do, then they really feel there's something special.
Mm.
And a paratrooper to maintain your status as a paratrooper, you've got to be in action. So you've got to fight. So if the chance comes to go to Rhodesia, you go. If you go to Zambia, you go.
Mm.
There was one company that deployed in Rhodesia. In fact, they had deployed in Ovamboland. They went back, and then they were deployed in Rhodesia. They came back and they were deployed straight up to the Caprivi, and they did a parachute drop, the whole company inside Zambia, and deployed in Zambia. And they came back from that and they went straight across to Ovamboland and did another parachute drop in Ovamboland for another operation there. And the next thing is there was one of these big operations taking place inside Angola, and they were latched onto one of the battle groups, and they had to go into Angola. So they literally fought in all four of those theaters in those countries
Well, mm.
during their national service. And that was they just regarded themselves as, well, man, our company's been so lucky. We've had the opportunity to do this.
Well,
So I
the,
never experienced anything like that I saw in there.
the feedback from our guys, and especially the RAR troops, was they were very impressed with the aggressiveness of the South Africans. They said once they sniffed blood, they were off like hounds.
Mm, mm.
And I think that's a very good reflection of the respect that leaders throughout the last 70 years have held for the South Africans. They were held in very high regard in the Second World War in North Africa and Italy.
Yeah.
And and now I believe you were a captain at that point. Is that right?
Yes, yes. So I was a captain and a company commander. In
Right.
fact, while our troops were being deployed in Rhodesia, we were we were doing our final phase of training before becoming operational, and we
Right.
were in Madimbu, just across the river from where our guys were being deployed in Rhodesia, and we were sort of champing at the bit, wanting to get finished with our training so we could also cross the border. But of course, the last few deployments for the fire forces, it there was virtually no call-outs anymore. It was leading up to the election, and the Brit, I forget what the
The
abbreviation was for the British force that was over there, but
monitoring force. I don't know what the
yeah,
abbreviation was, but monitoring. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. Well, they were deploying all over the place with these Land Rovers with big hoops of steel going over them, and we found that very, very amusing. So,
That's so that they could roll down a hill after they'd hit a landmine.
well, that's the only thing that we could think of that it could possibly have been used by them because it was very funny to see. But while we were up there, we suddenly got a signal from our headquarters, from the battalion in Bloemfontein, and they said, "Stand down on your training. You've got to take part in an operation." And so we thought, well, they're going to whip us off to Southwest Africa now. What's happening now? Because at that stage we knew that both fire forces um, on the other side of the river had stopped being called out. They were sitting at their bases waiting for something to happen, and the election was now looming. The next thing is we had to go to the Madimbu airfield and for an order group, and the Dakota comes in, and the two fire force commanders in their Rhodesian uniform step out, and they come and join us, and they say, "What's going on?" We said, "Well, we don't know. You could tell us what's going on." So then now there were four company commanders from one parachute battalion, two of them on their companies on the Limpopo side, on the South African side of the Limpopo, and two of them with their companies already in Rhodesia. And the battalion commander arrived with his headquarters staff and called us over, and we sat down under the wing of one of the C-130 aircraft, because there were suddenly there were four C-130, C-160 aircraft that had come up with them, and they were all parked on the runway now. And so we went and sat under the wing in the shade there, and he told us about this operation that we got to do. It was called Operation Melba, 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 and it was to be a battalion air assault, and there was an assembly point called Assembly Point Juliet inside the sort of southwestern part of Rhodesia, right on the banks of a river, with where there was a mission station. I think it was called the Zinzani mission, um, and all the insurgents had been now collected together inside these assembly points, where they would be disarmed and under the watchful eye of the British monitoring force. They would gather there while so that no intimidation could be done during the election, and the elections could be held fairly and freely. Now, how many of them were actually insurgents, and how many were just Mujibas that had been hooked up somewhere and chased into and given a few old Simonov rifles or something? I don't know. Who knows what the reality was? But according to intelligence, they had this uh, massive assembly point with over 1,000 Zanla insurgents in the one section and about 600 Zebra insurgents in the other section. Um, and the story was that with the Zebra insurgents, there were about 250 ANC guys, MK. Uh, I very much doubt whether that was the case. That was just a good excuse for us to become involved, you see. Now, this same operation was called by the Rhodesians was called Operation Quartz, and Quartz was supposed to be based on military intelligence, and this is why I have such a problem with military intelligence. Military intelligence had said that Mugabe has not got a chance in this election. Muzarewa is going to walk it. He's going to win it hands down. So you can work on that. So the military decided they would work on that. So Peter Walls decided, various elements within the Rhodesian armed forces were given assembly points that they were going to attack, and the South Africans were given this Juliet, which the paratroopers were going to attack. And the idea was that the day that the election results are made known, when everybody hears Muzorewa has won the election, immediately the war must now resume. And the first thing you do, but now the international community is going to accept that now there's been an election, and these other guys haven't got a leg to stand on. So now immediately we hit all of these assembly points, and you wipe out as many of them as possible, so that the cream of what's left of their forces has now been dealt a shattering blow, and now the Rhodesians are in a strong position again. Now, in retrospect, when I think back about it, I mean, I was a captain. This is an operation we're going to do. I didn't even know about the bigger picture. I only heard about that latest. I just heard this is the operation. This is the base we've got to go and attack. This Juliet assembly point. But in retrospect, I think about it, I think I can't believe that the guys actually took that intelligence seriously. That they decided this is that they made this whole plan based on such nonsense. But in any case, that's for them to answer to. I can't.
I think like the MK Cadres being their a false flag dummy sort of excuse. I think Muzorewa winning the elections was a parallel thing that everybody knew he wasn't. It was just an excuse to go and smash the heck out of these guys and perhaps
Well,
go. I know from studying a lot of other reports that their best troops were never put in those camps anyway.
yeah, I have no doubt about that. They wouldn't have done that. Why would they have done that? It would have been crazy to do.
Which was proven by the Inchambani battle in 81, when Josh and Koma brought all these troops into Guai River Mine. They were all the properly conventionally trained guys. They weren't the
Yeah. Anyway, this was the big operation. So what was going to happen now was the assault force would be made up of the two companies inside Rhodesia who would go in with the helicopters that they've got at their fire force bases. They would take off, go in, and they would attack from the one side, parallel with the river. The river on the one flank, and then on the other flank, and at the end, stop groups would be dropped, and that would be us. That we would do the drop a company on the one side, and on the far end we would drop another company to seal off this lot, and the attack would come from the south with the choppers, and they would send in Mirages from Petersburg Air Force Base. They would fly in. I think they had 6 or 8 Mirages that were going to launch a strike on the camp, the assembly point, minutes before the drop took place, and the helicopters went in. And then they had Alouette gunships with 20mm cannons above the river, making sure nobody got across the river, flying up and down the river. So it was quite a nice, tidy sort of plan. It looked pretty good, and I just wondered, because they told us that there was a British monitoring team in the base, in the assembly area. So and there was a road leading out, and I remember saying to my second in command, Herbie Poss, I was in the lower section with most of the company, and just on the other side of the road Herbie was with a smaller section of the company. That's where because we were going to be dropped exactly where we were going to form the stop line. And I said to him, Herbie, when we go in, the only thing that those Brits can do is they'll try and hightail it out of there, and they're going to have to take that road to go out because they got a Land Rover, and they're going to try and go out of there. So I don't care what you do, how you go about it, but I want a British SLR. They're a bit different to the FN. And I wanted an SLR. I said, so I don't care how or what you're going to do, but you just see that you get me an SLR. Anyway, that never happened, because we were all sitting around the radios waiting at Madimbu, all dressed in our gear to take off and go across the parachutes. We did a complete rehearsal. We used the airfield as the objective, and we dropped the paratroopers on the two sides of the airfield, and rehearsed coming in with the helicopters, and the bush is extremely dense there. So, and we were told that the bush around the assembly area is quite dense as well. So, we jumped, and parachutes stuck up in the trees, and guys swinging underneath the trees, and just getting the feel of the jumping in the trees and so on. I had a couple of casualties from that too. But anyway, we went through the whole rehearsal for the thing, and now we're sitting around the radio just waiting, and the election results start coming in, and it's just Mugabe, Mugabe, Mugabe,
Mm,
and Muzarewa doesn't even get a mention, and we're thinking now, so now what's going to happen?
mm,
Next minute, we get a signal coming from Pretoria. Operation Melba cancelled. Uh, all South African troops and equipment to withdraw from Rhodesia immediately.
mm.
So that was the end of that great big operation. So
Well, that's crazy. I mean, going further north, I've once came across the actual formal um, battle order or whatever for taking over the collection points, and it would have been a farce anyway, because in some places there were 3,000 insurgents, and we had like 1.5 companies of men going into it. It was a joke from the word go.
yeah,
So yeah, sad days, but interesting days. Well,
yeah.
since you wore a Rhodesian uniform, I'm going to allocate you the privilege, if you want to call it that, of being an honorary Rhodesian, which is what I give to any South
Well, thank you.
African. um,
As
but
I
yes,
as I had family in Rhodesia, I appreciate that, and as I lived there for a short while as a boy, yeah, thank you.
right. Well, we tick the box on that one, and I believe after that, all the Rhodesian uniforms were just chucked in a pile and
Yeah,
helicoptered back to Rhodesia.
I've always had a sort of a passing interest in military uniforms, field uniforms, and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. I'd built up quite a collection of my own over the years,
Mm.
and I, uh, I know I had the uniform that had been issued to me, which we now are supposed to. I oversaw my guys had all come and hand back their uniforms, and there was this mountain of Rhodesian camouflage gear that was now being brought back, and all the guys throwing their stuff onto and um, and then walking back across the runway to the dog bag and
In the
getting there
in the underpants, yeah.
in the underpants and boots. Yeah, so, so
I tell you what,
the,
if somebody
the,
had grabbed hold of that canvas full of uniforms and kept it till today, they would be worth an absolute fortune.
yeah, I can well believe it, because I mean there's lots of fake stuff wandering around, but if you get genuine stuff like that,
Yes,
with the collars and the labels and so on, you can see that it's genuine stuff.
yes, absolutely.
I'm sure it would get you'd get quite a lot for it. I went up to the commandant of the logistic base there, um, and he was standing looking at this lot. And I said to him, "Sir, what's going to happen now to all these uniforms?" So he said to me, "No, I've got to send them all back to Bulawayo." So I said, "Shucks, do you think I could get a set of these?" So he looked at me, he says, "Help yourself to as much as you want." So So I put together 5 complete sets, of everything: cap,
No.
jacket,
Oh,
shirt, trousers, and so on. And I packed them in and took them with my stuff. And I used that stuff to barter with other people to get other uniform bits and
oh,
pieces and so on. I should have kept them, eh?
a combat jacket now is worth about £1,000 on eBay, I think.
Really?
Yeah,
Wow.
geez, man, they precious. Um, that's because of time constraints. Or before we sort of wind up, um, did you find that little article on the commander going to Bulawayo, the humorous bit?
Man, for some reason I didn't, but let me have a quick look again, because
If you don't find it, you can give us the gist
yes,
of
here it is. Here it
it.
is. Here it is.
Excellent, well done. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah, well, let me read that to you. Um, little heading here, a secure secret. This is written by the man who sent it to me was a colonel at the time, Piet Nel, Graspol Nel. At the time, he was commanding F Company of 1 Parachute Battalion. He says, in late January 1980, I was summoned to an O Group held held in Bulawayo at HQ 1 Brigade. I was decked out in a freshly issued Rhodesian step-out uniform for the occasion, shirt sleeve order. It included a brand new pair of those excellent Velskoen suede shoes, with a Rhodesian para wing sewn onto my right sleeve and a green RLI beret and stable belt. When I walked into the room, before I had uttered a word, the British officer who was present as a member of the Commonwealth Monitoring Force greeted me with a smile and the words, "How's the commander of the South African Fire Force Zulu?" So much for our secret deployment in Rhodesia.
Good Lord, yeah. I think that uniform is what we call SANS.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
It's the SANS dress, yeah.
Yeah, we always referred to that sort of uniform as a step-out uniform. So
Isn't that funny? The guy, the guy knew exactly who he
he
was.
knew exactly what, yeah, exactly. But I mean, you know, we all know we had it in South Africa just as much as you would have had it in Rhodesia. But there were guys all over who were selling us out, who were telling
Oh, yeah.
telling the other guys what was going on. So
Mm. In conclusion, it's been a lovely talk, but we're a little bit pressed for time.
yeah.
Can you give me a 5-minute overview of captain to colonel in the South African Defence Force, and then very briefly from there to brigadier general, if you can keep it very brief, please.
Yeah, I had a very busy time as a captain. I was sent overseas twice. I did a Pathfinder course with the Israeli paratroops,
Oh,
and I did a commando course with the Chilean Special Forces in South America. Um, so it was a very interesting period as a captain. Then when I came back from Chile, I was promoted to a major. I continued. I served in 1 parachute battalion as a major. Um, and for several more years, also commanding a company and other posts in charge of training, the SO2 training, and I was second in command of the training wing, because 1 parachute battalion grew to a unit of 8 companies. So it was massive. It was actually a 2 battalion regiment, but it still continued with the name 1 parachute battalion. And half of the battalion was for training and the other half was for operations. So I was second in command of the training side. Um, then, because of the time I'd spent in Chile, where I had to learn some Spanish in order to go to Chile, um, I was suddenly called in by the commanding officer, and he said, "Would you? I've just been asked, the headquarters, Army headquarters, is looking for a Spanish-speaking officer to send on staff course to Spain. They see from your file that you have undergone Spanish language training, and they want to know whether you're interested in going to Spain for 2 years." I told them, yes, you're interested, so go and start packing your things. So that's how I came to go to Spain.
wow.
And I spent 2 years there, which was largely well, it was a highlight of my military career and my personal career because I was there with my family, and we had an incredible time in Spain. I came back and I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. We called them a commandant in those days. And as a lieutenant colonel, I was sent to our staff college as a DS, a member of the directing staff. And from there, I became the SO1 operations, which was essentially the chief of staff of the 44 Parachute Brigade. And I served there for about 2.5 years, and then the peace talks broke out, and I had a very brief exposure to that, to meeting some of my Cuban counterparts and talking to them in Spanish. Um, and I was appointed as the acting brigade commander because my commander became part of the negotiating team with the peace talks. Um, and next thing is he was promoted to brigadier, and I became a colonel, and I was given command of the brigade. So I stayed with the brigade for another three years after that as the commander, and during which time I was tasked to cross-train the brigade in amphibious operations, and we planned a huge amphibious stroke airborne assault on the port of Namib to try and cut the supply lines of the Cuban 50th Division.
Mm.
But then the peace talks got in the way, so that operation didn't take place either.
Wow.
Then I was taken from the brigade and made the commander of Group 18, which was responsible for um, urban counterinsurgency in the Greater Johannesburg area, which was not a pleasant job, but quite an important experience for me and a lot of very important exposure. From there, I was sent back to the Army College, and I was made the chief instructor at the Command and Staff Course. And I did that for a few years before I was appointed as the last military attaché to Taiwan. And I spent a couple of years in Taiwan as the military attaché. It was a very interesting experience, but it ended on a rather a sour note when my family and I were taken hostage by a crazed gunman, and for my sins, I got a bullet through the knee, and my daughter got a bullet through her wrist and in her back in an exchange of fire between this guy and the police. Fortunately, that was the only damage that either of us had. But my wife spent 26 hours as his last hostage before they managed to get her out, and he eventually surrendered, largely due to the persuasive powers of my wife. I have a remarkable, well, I had a remarkable wife. She's dead now, but she
Oh,
was
shit.
an exceptional person.
Oh,
Um, I came back from that and I was sent to Petersburg, where I was the SSO Ops for a year and a half. And while I was there, they appointed me as the commander of the Richmond Task Group because the ANC and the UDM, another political faction in South Africa, were busy slaughtering each other in this little village of Richmond in the Natal Midlands. And they had deployed a military force there and placed me in command of that. So I had to try and keep the peace there for a few months. And then I was quite unexpectedly promoted to Brigadier General. They changed the rank from Brigadier to Brigadier General, which is what the rest of the world calls their brigadiers anyway. So I was given 1-star rank, and I was made Chief of Staff of the newly established uh, Regional Joint Task Force South, based in Port Elizabeth. And I spent 3 years there, and then with our promotion, I was made the commander. But I was told to close down the headquarters and 5 other headquarters, and then I was sidelined due to affirmative action and told I can take a package and leave because they no longer have any job for me. So I said, no, I don't think I want to leave. I've only got a few years left before I retire. So you either find something to do with me, or else you're going to be paying me for doing nothing. Um, I found a task that I could do, a project that I ran, and that kept me busy for the last few years. And although they did appoint me for a while, as the last official appointment I had was the Director of Joint Doctrine Development. So I worked on developing doctrine for peace support operations and other operations in conjunction with other arms force and also other countries. And I retired at the age of 60, and they asked me to stay on in the reserve force to work on writing a new airborne doctrine, which I did. That kept me busy for quite a few years. And I eventually retired fully from that at the age of 68, and that was 9 years ago.
mm,
And I've had nothing more to do with the military since then,
wow.
except that I did spend about 4 years working for a private company doing consultations work with the Namibian Defence Force
Mm,
and helping them to write some of their doctrines,
mm,
which was extremely interesting because all the generals that I worked with over there were insurgents in plan with SWAPO, and I was able to discuss some of the operations that I was involved in, that they were also involved in, and
oh,
hear their side of the story. So,
yeah, I'd love to do that with our guys. Mac, I think we're going to have to leave it there.
yeah,
I
fine.
I cannot thank you enough for this interview. It's been thoroughly inspiring and interesting. And you're a very erudite man that can gather his thoughts and talk clearly. So thank you for a wonderful interview. I'm tempted to ask you for a second one because post South Africa just sounds absolutely incredible. I'll speak to John about that. Going off-piste a little bit, I'd just like to say to the regular viewers, thank you very much for subscribing. We've now reached our intermediate goal of 20,000. Please, if you haven't subscribed, please do so and smack that like bell, because it does help our YouTube algorithms. And I'd like to give a public thank you to John Van Sale, who owns this channel, just to say well done to him for the editing that he always does. I think he does a really good job, and he's not too well at the moment, so pray for him. Also think about supporting him on Patreon, as YouTube is his only income in the Philippines, and he's a lovely guy that's worth supporting. So thank you very much again, Mac. This has been a lovely interview, and I'm really pleased you came on board. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a privilege for me, Tony, and I appreciate you approaching me, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you indeed. Goodbye to you. Thanks, Mac. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.